How to translate civic planning into action. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski, and this is the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities, and many more. And today we will have an episode which is an effect of an interesting collaboration which is done between my podcast, Henning Larsen Architects, and also SPUR, which is a non-profit public policy organization in the San Francisco Bay Area that brings people together from across the political spectrum to develop solutions to the big problems that cities face. SPUR had a visit in Copenhagen, and we as Henning Larsen office were very happy to host the whole SPUR delegation, and we thought that it will be extremely interesting to leave a trace after this visit of SPUR organization in our office in Copenhagen. And we together decided to invite Alicia John-Baptiste, who is the CEO and president of SPUR, to share her perspective and knowledge on SPUR's activity, and also to get to know about the challenges and also the civic planning that is done by SPUR in the San Francisco Bay Area. SPUR, as I mentioned already, is an organization, public policy organization, that is recognized as a leading civic planning organization and is respected for its independent and holistic approach to urban issues. Since I have never been to the US myself, I was very keen on listening to Alicia's perspective on the development of the whole San Francisco Bay Area region and the challenges that this region may face. We talk about Alicia's interests and experience from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency or the City and County of San Francisco. We are introducing the scope of action of SPUR, which is the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association, and we are talking about the SPUR regional strategy, the Bay Area of 2070. If you would like to get to know anything more about SPUR, Henning Larsen, or this podcast, I will add the links to this episode description. And now I wanted to invite you to the newest episode with Alicia. I'm very happy to host you in the show, so welcome, Alicia.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy that we have this chance to meet. You have a study trip in Copenhagen, and you are visiting the office of Henning Larsen that I'm part of. And I happen to have this interesting initiative, which is called Urbcast, which is my podcast about cities and urbanism. And we thought that it would be so cool that we could just talk about your work a bit in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I just need to say that it is kind of a land that I didn't explore yet. I haven't been to the US yet. So I'm just very excited to talk about urbanism, about the city's challenges in this part of the world. But maybe before, it could be just great if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Alicia John-Baptiste. I'm the CEO of SPUR, and SPUR is the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association. And you can tell from the long name why we just call it SPUR. As the CEO, I run the organization. We have offices. We work both locally and regionally. So we have offices in the three big cities of the Bay Area, which are San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. That covers about a third of the population of the Bay Area as a whole. And I've been in this role for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I worked in local government for the city of San Francisco for almost 2 decades.
So if you introduce the context of your work and also the context of the San Francisco Bay Area, if someone is like me and doesn't know much about this region, what should be the first thing that we should be aware of when we talk about the urban planning in the area? And not only, but maybe let's start with this urbanism-related things.
Sure. I think the Bay Area for an outsider is such an interesting place because when assuming that you fly into one of the major airports in the region, what you'll see is an incredible landscape. It is a place of profound beauty and extraordinary diversity. 9 million people, over 100 different languages spoken.
Wow.
Just really pristine, open spaces, beautiful cities. And then the closer you get to the ground, the more you start to wonder what's happening here. Because when you get into the lived experience of the Bay Area, what you discover is that we have extraordinary disparities. We have disparities between wealth and income. We have disparities in quality of life. We have disparities in economic opportunity. We have disparities between our aspirations as a region and what we actually realize on the ground. And it's in that space that SPUR exists, between what we aspire to and where we are today. And I think about our work as really understanding from an urban planning perspective and from a policy perspective and from a government perspective, what is needed to realize our vision for ourselves, for the region as a whole, and the steps that we have to take to get from where we are today to where we would like to be in the future.
If I'm correct, you are urban planner yourself, and you have a big experience with transportation as well. And I'm very curious, how did you start as an urban planner, and what kind of brought you and what interested you the most if it comes to urban planning, civic planning?
Yes. So actually, my background is in public policy. I have a master's degree in public policy, and I became acquainted with urban planning once I started working for the planning department in San Francisco, as well as the transportation agency in San Francisco. And I think what I got from those experiences was both the contextual understanding that cities are actually planned. And that when there isn't a plan, things still happen. And those things will impact the opportunities that you have, the quality of life that you have. So you can plan for good things to happen. You can do no plan, and maybe good things will happen. Maybe they won't. And I think the other thing that I took from my time in government was just deep appreciation for practicality, for starting where you are and thinking about the steps that it takes to get from where you are to where you want to be in the future. I first appreciated urban planning, I think, in kind of the power of what it can do when I was on a walking tour of downtown San Francisco with the former planning director who had been in charge of the downtown plan in the 1980s. And this was now early 2000s. And he was pointing out to me the buildings that existed because of the planning that was done, but also that there was still the shoe repair shop and the small cafe and the residences, and that all of that was by design. And as somebody new to urban planning, you don't necessarily know that the experiences that you're having are things that were actually designed.
Yeah.
You might assume that they just happen by accident or happen organically, and it's not necessarily the case.
I think that it is a very interesting perspective on planning in this big scale. But do you think that sometimes it is also a threat because you kind of can overdo the planning? And what if the plans are not that good and then the effect is actually a bit disappointing?
Yes, I think that's absolutely, it's a threat on two levels. One level is that you can plan for too long. You can seek perfection. And in seeking perfection, you can spend 10 years, 15 years, 20 years arguing over the same set of points, or, arguing for a particular version of a vision, where in truth, people would be better served if you just had a good idea that you started to try to implement rather than trying to wait for perfection. So I think we suffer from that in the Bay Area quite a bit. And then on the flip side, I think sometimes we can be too quick, or we can think that we can be too influenced by the trends of the moment. And we have areas in the Bay Area that are more recently developed that the experience that people have of them is of a place that sort of lacks soul, that lacks humanity. And I think it's a reflection of too much of one moment in time thinking as well. So it's a struggle to balance between the two, but I think there's a threat on both sides.
So I think it's especially a big challenge if one is a perfectionist and wants to do the urban planning. And as you mentioned, especially I also realized that as I'm urban planner by training myself, by education. And I found it so, maybe not frustrating, but it was so challenging if you think about that. If you do the urban planning and master planning, it takes so much time for those plans to be laid out. And then it's also like so hard to see the effect of your work because it takes so much time to take it into the real action kind of. And this is also the scope of this conversation that I wanted to especially focus on. So how to create like a real action from the kind of high level planning and high level civic planning. And maybe that's also a good moment to talk about SPUR a bit, because I guess that it is an organization that it is very influential in the region if it comes to urban planning. But yes, maybe let's start with the background of this organization that you are leading.
Sure. One thing I'll note, because I know that you are much younger than I am, is that the older that you get, the more that decades it takes to affect real change start to make sense. I had less appreciation for that probably when I was your age than I do now at my age. And at the same time, I remain very impatient, for the change to happen on the ground.
Yeah.
So SPUR, speaking of being old, SPUR is 110 years old. It was founded right after the earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco, and was founded on the premise that when the city was rebuilding housing, it needed to rebuild at a particular level of quality. And as an organization, SPUR has cared about housing ever since. I think the work that we do, because we sit outside of government, we have the ability to articulate a vision for the region that is more aspirational than what government can provide. Because government has to be constrained by the practical reality of today, by how much money there is, by the political influences, by the kind of socioeconomic dynamics that influence cities. Whereas we can sit on the outside and say, it's not enough, right? We need to be thinking bigger. We need to wish for more. We need to believe that we as a community deserve more than the way that we live today, where so many people really live in a lot of misery, to be honest. And it's hard, I think, for people in a country like Denmark to understand the level of misery that we tolerate in the United States. And that's true for the Bay Area as well. So I really see our job as saying this is what we can achieve, but also being very, as I said earlier, very practical about it. So we recently produced a long-range plan looking out to 2070 and asking the question, if what we aim for is a region where everybody can truly thrive, how do we get there? And ask the hard questions. If we know that we're likely to grow by another 4 million people, do we actually have space for them? Can we accommodate people without building into the greenfields? Can we retrofit our transportation system so that we can meet our climate goals? Asking those questions in a very rigorous way. And what we found is that, yes, we can do that. It requires really following what I think of as sort of the essential urbanist principles, that you have dense infill development around sustainable transportation modes. You provide all of the quality of life amenities that people need within walking distance so that everybody has access to open space and to banks and grocery stores and, just all of the things that people need for life. Requires thinking differently about how we use water. But these are all achievable things that we can do. We have to start with where we're trying to go and work back from that. And so that's also part of our role as an organization. We do the research, but then we also do the advocacy, where we go then to the government authorities and say, this is what we want to see happening, at multiple different scales.
I was wondering about this practical and theoretical parts, because from the one side, it is, air quotes, easy to create a strategy, but the other thing is to follow and make it happen. So I think that my point here is about the feasibility and how to tackle that if we are talking about such a vast scope and such a vast time frame, because I hope that we can also talk about this regional strategy for the Bay Area of 2070, but it's in 48 years. So first thing is like how to be prepared for that, to create a meaningful action and feasible action. And the second thing is that we are not talking about one city. We are not talking about a small city of Copenhagen, but we are talking about the whole Bay Area, the whole region.
That's right. Yeah. So I think, honestly, I've been having a lot of conversations with other leaders recently that we need to shift our focus away from spending so much time thinking about what needs to happen and to spend more time thinking about how to make that happen, because that's where we truly get stuck, particularly in the Bay Area, is in the how to actually move the vision forward. And to be 100% honest, to me, the most important first step in the how is to get past the cynicism and the despair that so many of us live with. I mean, I live in a country where we just had a few days ago the mass murder of 19 children in the state of Texas. And this is something that happens over and over again in my country, and nobody does anything about it. And when you live in that kind of an environment, it can be really hard to believe that something can change, that we ourselves as individuals, who are we? We're small people, right? Who are we to make change? It can be hard to hold on to that hope and that belief. And I believe that the first step in actualizing a vision like the one that we've laid out is to sustain that belief, to sustain that hope, to sustain that faith. That's the very first thing. Then from there, again, I'm going to go back to the theme of practicality. You just have to look at what's the gap between where we are and where we want to go. And so for us, we've created 5-year strategies. So we started with a 50-year strategy, and then we said, okay, 50 years, that's a lot of stuff. We don't have that many staff. And certainly we don't act alone. You know, we're too small of an organization to do all of this by ourselves. And I don't think that's a successful model anyway. I think all of this has to be in partnership. And so then we say, okay, in the next 5 years. So to take one example, we desperately need to eliminate our carbon emissions as a region. And 40% of our carbon emissions come from existing buildings, right? And so we are now very focused on figuring out how do we decarbonize our existing buildings. And those are very achievable steps. It's making sure that new appliances only run on electricity, that we don't run gas in our homes anymore. These are things that can be accomplished in the next 3 to 7 years. And so we break it into achievable pieces. That's a very, very important part of it. And then we celebrate the wins as well, because you've got to know, you have to be able to track that you are making progress in these long-term endeavors. And I think the other dynamic that is essential, I spoke a little bit about, none of us does this by ourselves. We have to build partnership. It's also building partnership with the communities that we serve. So it's not just the decision makers in the government, and it's not just the decision makers who are sort of the power brokers of our region. It's also the communities themselves, and being able to articulate a vision and articulate a pathway that invites people into the actions that we are trying to take.
In this framework, I guess there are a lot of puzzle pieces, and I was wondering, like, what's the role of organizations like yours, but there's also government in play. And there are also different design offices, including Henning Larsen, because I think we are aligned if it comes to the decarbonization. This is also one of our key goals right now. We also understand the complexity and the challenge of the climate change, and that especially we as architects, we need to act. We are the ones also building, so we need to do it in a smart way. So what would you say an effective framework could look like if it comes to those different actors, different players, the organizations, the design offices, the country, and also the administration, I guess. But I assume also there are more players than that, right?
Sure. The players are infinite in some ways, right? There's so many different actors, and the Bay Area has a very healthy nonprofit community, of advocates and think tanks and business representation. So it's a very kind of complex environment that we operate in. But I think that everybody has a role to play. And if we can align on, say, one goal being, we want the region to be carbon-free. We know that this is possible, right? This is something that we can achieve. We can be a carbon-free region. That gives each of the actors the opportunity to ask themselves, what's my role in this? How do I contribute to this? So if I'm designing a building, how do I design it in such a way that it's going to have a neutral footprint? I also think in the bigger picture of sort of the vision of how we live together, there's a really important role for both architecture and urban design in that so often the communities, at least in the Bay Area, I don't know if it's the same here, but in the Bay Area, when we talk about change, we talk about development, the people's first reaction is no, right? People's first reaction is to fear that they will lose something in that process. They'll lose their sense of place. They'll lose their understanding of their neighborhood. They might lose property value, whatever it is that they're concerned about. Their first fear is one of loss. And so I think there's an incredibly important role for architects and designers of all types to be able to illustrate and demonstrate to people that actually it's an opportunity for gain, that your neighborhood, your day-to-day life can improve exponentially with the addition of new buildings, new parks, new plazas, changes to the public realm that allow us to use it in a way that fits better with 2022 than 1970 when it might have been initially created. So I think there's sort of infinite possibility in what actors can bring to this. I think the challenge, of course, is making sure that we're keeping that vision at the center of the work that all of us are doing. That's how we get there.
I think that's inspiring. And I think that it is. When you presented it like this, I think it is achievable in a way, but it also depends on the goal, right? As you said, we need to choose one goal and then try to stick to that. But what if there are many more problems and challenges and you actually need to think about more goals, like how to tackle the need and the environment in which you need to act in kind of on different fields because there are so many problems or challenges?
I think that's exactly, you're describing exactly the challenge that we're facing today in our urban planning conversations, because we have had an awakening in the United States and particularly in the Bay Area around the ways in which lack of justice, lack of equality between people is hindering our ability to actually thrive as a community. So the playbook that urban planners have had in place around how to improve a neighborhood or improve a community, it doesn't stand any longer because we have a history in our country of using urban planning as a way to segregate communities and as a way to essentially oppress parts of our community. When we use the same tools that have served as vehicles of oppression, we're met with a lot of mistrust, which I think is very well deserved. And in many cases, the strategies that we've used have actually harmed members of our community. And so we're in a position now where we actually have to design new tools. We have to come up with new ways of doing things. And what I'm seeing in the dialogue around this is an unfortunate lack of grace. When we are in a position where we don't yet know, when we're still learning, we have to be given permission to experiment. We have to be able to try things and undo them if they don't work, be willing to undo them if they don't work, admit that we did something wrong, and then try the next thing, learn from what we're attempting to do. And because we're in this position right now where the answer has to be perfect, going back to the problem with perfection, the answer has to be perfect, we're stuck. And so we do nothing. And doing nothing is an action because doing nothing means that we continue the trajectory of the status quo, which is in and of itself harmful. So my hope is that we can start to introduce a little bit more, again, grace and forgiveness and experimentation and creativity into the process as we move forward.
I would use the analogy of a startup setup.
Exactly.
I think that companies and also, as you say, your organization or in general, you as multiple actors in the region, you act as a startup. You don't know what the future will bring and you are, I guess, motivated. You have a lot of power and inspiration, but you don't know you have the goal as well, but you are not pretty sure what's the right method, right? I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that you can fail sometimes and then try to learn.
I think that's right.
And I think that now it's also a good moment to talk a bit about this regional strategy in the Bay Area of 2070. I just visited the website. It seems to be a very attractive way of showing it because the website, it kind of helps you with the storytelling. It gets you through the mission and the ideas behind it. But how much does it take to prepare such a strategy and how to make it, again, feasible? So it's not only a document that someone is publishing and then you are happy and then you forget, but that it is still kind of present in the daily work?
That's such a good question. And it took a lot of work. It took, depending on who you ask, it took somewhere between 3 and 6 years to put all of that together. At the end of the day, I think we came up with 178 policy recommendations, and some of them are very big and some of them are very small, but there's a lot of them. And, when we published it, we had a similar question. How does this become a living document versus something that sort of sits on the shelf and we say, oh yeah, remember when we did that big project and we came up with all those recommendations? So for us as an organization, we keep it very central because it's our vision, it's our mission, it's our starting point. Every time we are tackling a new question, we're asking ourselves, how does this relate to the long-term strategy when we're thinking about what are we going to work on in a given year? we are asking what is the most kind of important and or ripe element of the vision that we hold to move forward in this moment. Because of course, we have to work with political windows of opportunity. Sometimes you have to try to create those political windows, but when they do open, you want to be ready to jump through them as well. So it's a practice. I think if I had a critique of the way that we've managed this process, it's that I don't think we have yet figured out how to convey all the richness of that strategy and vision in a 2-minute conversation. And that's the part that I think I'd love to crack the code on that at some point, and I'm not sure that I have yet.
Before I finish on a more personal note, I wanted to ask the title question. I was imagining the title to be How to Translate Civic Planning into Action, and I was wondering if you could give an answer to that.
Yes. So I have spent my career trying to drive systems change. And what I've come across is sort of two different models that I work with. And there's one model, which is, I love this model, and I didn't create this, but it's imagine an inverted pyramid. Yeah. And at the top of the pyramid, what you see are the rules and the policies and the way that, resources flow. And that's sort of that clearly has an impact on how things work. What the rules are has an impact on how things work. But then at the next scale, there's relationships and power structures. So thinking about how decisions even get made in the first place, who's at the table, who's deciding what the rules are going to be, and how comprehensive is the point of view of the people who are in that conversation. And then at the base of this inverted pyramid is mental models. And that's a question of how do we even think? What do we think is possible? What do we think is causal? Is it actually causal? And so interrogating those mental models, to me, is the most powerful way to create change. Because if you can convince people that a constraint that they always believed was inevitable is actually changeable, you open up a whole different realm of possibility. The other thing that I think I've learned through much trial and error, I've had so many failures in my career, but some successes as well.
Isn't it a good sign?
I hope so. I hope it means I'm learning and growing and trying, right? That I'm ambitious. I keep trying.
Exactly.
But one of the things that I've learned is that if you don't truly align people around what you're trying to achieve, you can get something to happen for a period of time if you put enough kind of control on top of it. But the second you lift that control, it goes back to the state of affairs it had been before. It's like entropy. So the critical component of driving change is actually aligning the people around that change. And that's why I think it would serve all of us who are in kind of the planning and policy and civic space to spend more time thinking about how do we create that alignment versus how do we convince people to do what we want them to do.
And on an even more personal note, because I guess that the experience and also, as you said, the failures and the success that you achieved, it is a very personal lens. And to get even a bit more of that, what do you think that the Bay Area will look like in 48 years, referring to the 2070 scope of the strategy?
Yeah. What do I think it will look like in 48 years? Well, what I hope it will look like, I hope that it will be even more diverse than it is today. It is a very diverse region, but it's diverse in pockets. And I would love to see a place where that diversity was everywhere all the time, much more just sort of to be expected. I hope that it will be a place where the people continue to really value the environment and the role that nature plays in our lives. My hope is that it'll be a place where you can easily get where you need to go without having to get into a car. That would be extraordinary if we could make that transformation. And that would take about 50 years, I think. And my hope is that really at the most foundational level, my hope is that the Bay Area becomes a place where people truly understand that there is no difference between individual quality of life and community quality of life. If we want individual well-being, we have to create community well-being. It's the only way that we achieve our individual aspirations is when the community can also achieve its aspirations. I hope that that ethos takes root in the Bay Area.
And the last one, on a more, I would say, personal note, and it is about education. So I would like to ask you if you can recommend a book. Could be close to our topic, but not necessarily.
So the book that I'm reading right now, which might sound a little bit strange as a title, but the book I'm reading right now is called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. Leading is, I think the subtitle is Leading in Liminal Space or something like that. And it is really very much about how to provide leadership in that space of emerging knowing. And I do feel very much that that's where we are in this moment in time. And I have found it very helpful.
Thank you for this recommendation. I hope that the listeners can also check. And I hope they will also find it interesting. Alicia, thank you for your knowledge, for experience that you shared with me and the listeners. And also thank you for your time. I guess that your schedule is quite tight. Once you have this trip to Copenhagen, there are, of course, multiple things to see and places to visit. So thank you for taking this time to visit the Henning Larsen studio and having this conversation with me in Urbcast. Thank you.
It has been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast, and I hope that this episode, and especially talking about the context of San Francisco Bay Area, was interesting to you as well. As I mentioned, I've never been into this part of the world, so I was really interested in Alicia's perspective and the challenges that this region might face. And my main motivation, my main point was to talk about how can we transfer this planning, the civic planning, the urban planning on this more strategic level with all different documents like the regional strategy for the Bay Area of 2070 into a more feasible daily action that the citizens of such region might just feel on the daily basis. I am also very happy that this episode could be done as a collaboration between me, Henning Larsen, architects that I'm also part of, and also the SPUR organization. If you would like to get to know anything more about Henning Larsen, SPUR, or this podcast, please visit the websites that I added into the episode description, and I hope to talk to you very soon.